What if I told you that love isn't the strongest force guiding human connection? That beneath every romantic gesture, every emotional bond, there lies a deeper, more powerful instinct quietly shaping everything. An instinct older than passion, more enduring than attraction, and absolutely essential for true intimacy. It's not love, it's something far more primal. Let's uncover the one force that silently controls everything beneath the surface. In the depths of the human psyche, there are forces that guide behavior long before conscious thought arrives. Among these forces is an instinct older than romance, deeper than attraction, and more stable than affection. It is the instinct for security, a longing not simply for physical safety but for emotional certainty, inner grounding, and psychic containment. In many cases, this instinct precedes love and governs decisions more profoundly than the longing for passion or connection. While love can be spontaneous, impulsive, and at times chaotic, the need for security is rooted in the very architecture of the unconscious mind. It does not demand attention through grand gestures, but exerts its influence quietly and persistently, shaping the terrain of the inner world. Love may draw one toward another, but it is security that determines whether one stays, opens, and trusts. In the feminine psyche especially, this need for inner stability can be traced to archetypal patterns that value preservation over risk, cohesion over fragmentation, and psychological shelter over emotional exposure. The desire for love is powerful, but without security, without the sense that one is safe, seen, and steady, love remains at the surface, never permitted to sink into the depths where transformation occurs. Security is the condition in which vulnerability becomes possible. It is not driven by fear, but by the archetypal longing for order in the face of life's chaos. Where love offers intensity, security offers continuity. Where love may burn and fade, security provides a stable flame. This instinct does not operate from the ego, but from the collective unconscious, a reservoir of inherited memory and ancestral pattern. It whispers, not shouts. It guides from beneath, often unnoticed until absent. And when it is absent, the entire structure of relationship falters. Even when love is abundant, if security is missing, the foundation is unstable. This is why many are drawn more powerfully to someone who brings peace rather than passion. The instinct for security governs the selection of relationships, the level of emotional exposure one is willing to offer, and the degree to which the soul feels free to unfold. It is not simply a preference, but a governing force that shapes behavior, choices, and emotional boundaries. Security, in its truest form, is not a mere reaction to external threats or material instability. It is an ancient, archetypal force embedded within the collective unconscious, a psychological pattern that transcends time, culture, and individual experience. This instinct is not shallow or optional. It is as fundamental to the psyche as oxygen is to the body. At its core, the longing for security reflects the archetype of preservation, an inner blueprint that prioritizes the nurturing, sustaining, and protecting of life, both physically and emotionally. This archetypal pattern is seen throughout nature, in the womb that shelters the unborn child, in the mother who guards her young, in the rhythms of the earth that provide cycles of renewal. It is an instinct that quietly governs countless decisions and reactions, often far beyond conscious awareness. Jung observed that archetypes manifest not just in behaviors, but in dreams, myths, and symbolic images. Security is symbolized by enclosed spaces, strong structures, circles, homes, and sanctuaries. These symbols appear again and again in the psyche, especially in moments of uncertainty, upheaval, or emotional risk. The drive to return to what feels known, safe, and whole is not a weakness, but a spiritual and psychological necessity. Within the feminine psyche, this instinct takes on particularly nuanced forms. It is not a demand for control, but a call for coherence, a psychic order that allows the emotional body to function without fragmentation. It is an internal compass pointing towards stability so that the self can unfold in its fullness without fear of psychic disintegration. Without this inner security, the psyche is flooded with anxiety, mistrust, and defense mechanisms. Relationships become survival zones rather than spaces of growth. But when this archetypal need is acknowledged and honored, it becomes the sacred ground upon which genuine intimacy, trust, and transformation can take place. It is not about dependency or weakness, but about honoring the inner architecture of the soul. When people mistake this instinct as merely emotional clinginess or avoidance of risk, they fail to see its deeper roots. It is a mythic pattern, the eternal image of the container that protects the sacred flame within. This instinct belongs not only to women, but to the feminine archetype present in all humans. Recognizing it allows for greater understanding, deeper connection, and a more truthful path toward inner wholeness. The experience of love, while powerful and transformative, does not arise in isolation. It requires a psychic environment in which it can safely take root, and that environment is defined by security, emotional certainty, a sense of groundedness, and the assurance that one will not be emotionally destabilized are all prerequisites for love to flourish at a deep and sustainable level. Before love can be fully experienced or expressed, the psyche instinctively seeks to answer a more fundamental question: am I safe here? This question is not merely about physical safety, but about psychological and emotional space, about whether one's innermost self can exist without fear of fragmentation or betrayal. Without that sense of safety, love remains a surface-level experience, often characterized by anxiety, suspicion, or a guarded heart. The desire for emotional stability is rooted in the unconscious drive for integration. The human psyche craves wholeness, not chaos. It is drawn toward relationships that offer resonance, predictability, and the quiet assurance that emotional exposure will not be punished. When these conditions are met, love becomes expansive rather than restrictive, liberating rather than consuming. It becomes a conscious act rather than a desperate clinging to connection for survival. Many confuse intensity with depth, mistaking the fires of passion for the roots of true connection. But without emotional security, love burns fast and dies young. True intimacy requires the courage to be seen fully, and that courage only emerges when one feels emotionally anchored. In this way, security is not an alternative to love, but its silent prerequisite. It is the ground on which the house of love is built. The psyche intuitively recognizes this and will resist surrendering to love if the foundation is shaky. Even in relationships where attraction is strong and affection is sincere, the absence of emotional safety creates a kind of spiritual hesitation. There is a holding back, a caution, a subtle withdrawal of the soul from what could otherwise be a transformative union. The longing for love may be genuine, but it cannot override the instinct to protect the self from psychological harm. Until there is a sense of security, love is approached with the brakes half on. When the brakes are released, it is only because the unconscious has determined that the terrain is stable, the threat is low, and the risk of vulnerability is outweighed by the promise of connection. The relationship between security and love is not oppositional but foundational. Love, by nature, is fluid, emotional, and unpredictable. It moves like water, capable of nourishing or overwhelming, healing or drowning. Without a container to hold it, love spills everywhere, losing its form and power. Security provides that container. It is the structure within which the volatile energies of love can be held, understood, and directed. Just as fire needs a hearth to burn safely and usefully, love requires the steady presence of emotional safety to sustain its warmth and light over time. Security is what allows love to deepen instead of fade, to expand instead of destabilize. In its absence, love may appear bright and passionate, but it often flickers quickly, consumed by fear, doubt, or unmet needs. Security, on the other hand, gives love a place to rest, to return, to grow. It is the inner sanctuary where affection becomes trust, where attraction becomes devotion, and where emotional intensity finds rhythm and purpose. This is not a mechanical transaction, but a psychological necessity deeply embedded in the unconscious. When one feels secure, the nervous system relaxes, the heart opens, and the psyche permits vulnerability, a vital ingredient for any authentic relationship. Without this sense of safety, love becomes a negotiation of boundaries and a silent calculation of risk. People may engage, but they do so half-heartedly, with one foot always ready to step away if the foundation begins to crack. Security transforms this guardedness into presence. It allows for emotional consistency, which is more valuable over time than grand romantic gestures. It creates a sense of belonging that is not based on performance or appearance, but on being fundamentally accepted. In such an environment, love becomes a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. This transformation is not only relational but internal. The psyche, once unsure and defensive, now finds the conditions to integrate and expand. The self becomes more coherent, more resilient, more whole, and from that wholeness, deeper love emerges. Love that is not afraid to endure storms because it knows it is rooted in something immovable. Love, then, is not only a feeling but a state of being nurtured by the reliability and depth of security. It becomes a sacred exchange between souls who recognize that true freedom does not arise from detachment, but from the grounded confidence that one is emotionally safe to fully exist in another's presence. The instinct for security is not an external pursuit, but a deeply internal compass that silently guides the psyche toward wholeness. It governs the way the mind organizes emotional experience, the way the heart opens or closes, and the way the soul decides whether it is safe to emerge. It is not merely about comfort or protection, but about integration, the sacred work of bringing fragmented parts of the self into alignment. Without this instinct, emotional life becomes chaotic, inconsistent, and difficult to navigate. With it, the individual gains an internal orientation, a felt sense of groundedness that allows for clearer perception, stronger boundaries, and authentic emotional expression. This instinct acts as an internal guardian of psychological order. When it is activated, the unconscious mind begins scanning not just for threats but for patterns of stability. It evaluates environments, relationships, and even self-perception through the lens of safety and coherence. If there is resonance, if the surroundings support emotional clarity and relational honesty, the instinct relaxes and the psyche moves naturally toward unity. But if the environment is unpredictable, unstable, or emotionally erratic, the instinct tightens and the self becomes fragmented in response. This process is not driven by logic or external analysis. It is intuitive and archetypal, rooted in symbols and emotions that often escape conscious awareness. Within this framework, security becomes a prerequisite for emotional integration. The soul cannot unfold in an atmosphere of threat. Vulnerability, empathy, compassion, and trust all depend on the prior condition of feeling internally safe. Without that foundation, the self becomes hypervigilant, reactive, or withdrawn, not out of weakness, but out of an innate drive to preserve the psychic structure. Integration requires emotional rhythm, and rhythm depends on consistency. The instinct for security is what creates the psychic space for this rhythm to emerge. When honored, it leads to emotional maturity, deeper self-awareness, and the capacity to form enduring bonds. It is not the absence of fear, but the presence of an inner signal that says, I am whole enough to stay present. As this instinct operates beneath the surface, it shapes the course of relationships, the perception of others, and even the experience of time. It allows the self to remain connected, centered, and grounded even in the face of emotional complexity. The instinct for security, then, is not a passive reaction but an active force of inner alignment. It is the very mechanism through which the unconscious supports the lifelong journey toward individuation and self-realization. When the instinct for security is denied or unmet, the unconscious mind begins to send signals in the form of emotional turbulence. These signals are not arbitrary. They are deeply symbolic expressions of a destabilized inner world. The archetype of the shadow begins to emerge, often not as malevolence, but as fear, withdrawal, suspicion, or over-control. The psyche responds to a lack of emotional safety with protective mechanisms designed to minimize vulnerability and reduce the perceived risk of emotional harm. These responses are rarely conscious and often misunderstood. They manifest in subtle ways: defensiveness in conversation, reluctance to trust, sudden mood shifts, or the urge to distance oneself without understanding why. This is not a reflection of weakness, but the psyche's natural effort to preserve cohesion when the ground beneath it feels unstable. The shadow archetype is not inherently negative. It is the disowned part of the self, the collection of thoughts, feelings, and instincts pushed into the unconscious because they do not align with the conscious self-image. But under stress, the shadow rises not to destroy, but to protect. It acts as a barrier, preventing further exposure to psychological pain by limiting openness, emotional generosity, or spontaneous connection. In relationships, this leads to patterns of sabotage, where one longs for closeness but unconsciously pushes it away. These patterns are expressions of an internal conflict between the desire to love and the fear of being unprotected while doing so. Without emotional security, the mind interprets intimacy as a risk rather than a refuge. Even the most caring gestures can be filtered through a lens of skepticism, shaped by past wounds and unmet needs. The shadow says, do not trust too easily, and in doing so, it keeps the heart from reaching the depths it yearns for. This reaction is archetypal, not personal. It can be traced across myth, dream, and symbol, where the hero must first confront the darkness within before they can find true union or wholeness. In the same way, the psyche must navigate through the energies of the shadow when security is lacking. It must acknowledge fear without surrendering to it, and it must find ways to reestablish safety from within. The reemergence of trust, calm, and emotional clarity is a sign that the instinct for security has been rebalanced, allowing the self to return to a state where love, connection, and individuation are again possible. Security in its truest form is not a cage or a limitation, but the foundation from which authentic freedom and emotional expansion arise. Many misunderstand the idea of emotional safety as something that restricts spontaneity or dulls passion. Yet, it is quite the opposite. Within the psyche, security provides a grounded structure that allows one to explore, to feel deeply, and to engage fully without the constant threat of emotional collapse. This groundedness gives love the space to breathe and evolve. It is not the absence of conflict or the avoidance of challenge, but the presence of a stable core that can hold emotional tension without breaking. When the unconscious feels secure, it opens doors that would otherwise remain locked. Vulnerability, creativity, and deep emotional expression only flourish in conditions where the soul feels it will not be punished for its truth. Security becomes the sacred container in which the psyche dares to reveal itself layer by layer, trusting that it will not be shattered by judgment or abandonment. It is from this container that emotional maturity is born. Without security, the self remains fragmented, acting from fear or need. With it, love can move from impulse to intention, from dependency to devotion, from reaction to conscious engagement. It allows both individuals to bring their full selves forward without apology or pretense. In this space, love does not have to be perfect to be powerful. It only has to be real. The feeling of being emotionally safe gives rise to the courage to confront shadows, to hold space for another's complexity, and to remain present when the easier path would be withdrawal. Emotional security gives the psyche permission to stay connected even in difficulty, because it knows that disconnection is no longer a threat to the self-survival. This is the essence of real intimacy, the ability to be fully seen and to remain soft in that exposure. The unconscious seeks this not just for comfort, but because it is through this kind of safety that integration and wholeness become possible. Within this space, love becomes a conscious, grounded choice rather than a fleeting emotional state. It becomes a force that builds rather than burns, that restores rather than consumes. Through the presence of emotional security, love ceases to be something one falls into blindly and becomes instead a sacred ground two souls agree to walk upon with awareness, care, and truth. The soul does not unfold in noise, confusion, or chaos. It opens in silence, in rhythm, in the quiet assurance that it is allowed to exist without threat. Security creates the psychological conditions necessary for this unfolding. It is not a luxury, but a requirement for the inner self to emerge in its fullness. Within the unconscious, there is a deep intelligence that waits for signals of safety before releasing the more vulnerable aspects of the self. These aspects, tenderness, intuition, deep emotion, and the sacred longing for union, cannot be forced into the light. They bloom only when the psyche senses that the ground is stable and the environment will not betray its openness. The instinct for security is the gatekeeper of this process. It does not stop love from arriving, but it determines whether love is permitted to grow roots. It acts like the soil for a seed. Without it, the seed remains dormant, refusing to rise despite the presence of light. Security tells the unconscious, you can rest now, you are not in danger. And only in that restfulness does the soul begin to integrate, express, and connect. Integration, in Jungian terms, is the bringing together of the conscious and unconscious parts of the self. It is a process that demands not only courage but also consistency. Emotional safety offers that consistency. It holds space for the self to become whole without rushing or forcing. When emotional safety is present, the defenses of the ego relax, and what was hidden in shadow can be gently brought forward. The individual begins to feel at home not only in the relationship but within their own inner landscape. Patterns that once repeated out of survival are questioned, softened, and eventually released. The person who once clung to control or shut down in fear starts to experience emotional flexibility. New choices become available, not because the outer world has changed, but because the inner world has stabilized. In this state, love is no longer a survival strategy, but a natural expression of a self that feels aligned, grounded, and whole. The love that emerges from this place is rich, nuanced, and deeply human. It has room for joy and grief, for strength and fragility, for independence and union. It is love that honors the process of becoming, not just the appearance of connection. The longing for love is universal, but it is often misunderstood in its expression. Many seek love in its most visible forms, passion, chemistry, attention, but overlook the quieter, deeper desire for peace. The unconscious is not drawn merely to excitement or emotional intensity. It is magnetized by what feels calm, predictable, and emotionally regulating. Peace is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of coherence. It is a state in which the nervous system can settle, where the psyche can rest without the fear of sudden emotional shifts or unpredictable responses. In this state of peace, the soul feels invited rather than demanded, witnessed rather than judged. This is why the instinct for security often overrides the desire for love in its conventional forms. The psyche seeks what feels safe before it seeks what feels exhilarating. It is not that it rejects passion, but that it knows passion without stability burns too fast and too hard, often leaving ash instead of growth. The unconscious is drawn to relationships that feel emotionally grounded, where there is rhythm instead of chaos and reliability instead of confusion. In such spaces, the individual begins to associate connection with safety rather than danger. This shift is profound. It rewires old patterns of attachment, reduces inner conflict, and allows a person to open up in ways that are sustainable. The pull toward peace is not a rejection of love, but a refinement of what love must contain to be truly transformative. Many are surprised to find themselves stepping away from what once felt irresistible, a relationship charged with intensity but unstable in its core, and towards something that offers emotional ease. This is not settling, it is evolving. The psyche knows what it needs in order to heal, and that need often comes in the form of stillness, presence, and attunement. A peaceful connection allows the unconscious to relax its defenses and permits the real self to emerge. It fosters a kind of love that is not performative or idealized, but deeply real, rooted in the day-to-day experience of being emotionally held. The desire for peace reflects the inner self's recognition that love is not measured by how intensely it begins, but by how deeply it is sustained. This is the kind of love that does not consume the self, but integrates it. The instinct for security operates beneath conscious awareness, quietly guiding emotional responses, shaping relational choices, and influencing the way one experiences trust and connection. It is not loud or dramatic, but steady and unrelenting, like a current running beneath the surface of one's life. When it is unmet, this instinct does not vanish. It intensifies, often redirecting attention toward people or situations that appear to offer safety, even if they lack emotional richness. This explains why some are drawn to partners who feel predictable rather than passionate, or why others may hesitate to engage deeply with someone who seems too emotionally volatile. The psyche is constantly making unconscious calculations. Is this space safe for me to be vulnerable? Can I bring my full self here without fear of rejection, abandonment, or instability? If the answer is no, the instinct for self-protection is activated. The individual may withdraw, suppress their feelings, or cling to control mechanisms not out of choice, but out of an innate drive to shield the psyche from fragmentation. These behaviors are not flaws, they are responses to an unbalanced inner system. Understanding this instinct shifts the way love and connection are approached. One begins to see that relationships are not simply about emotional expression or compatibility, but about the ability to offer and receive psychological safety. Love becomes less about finding someone who excites and more about finding someone who regulates. In this light, the instinct for security becomes a guide rather than an obstacle. It points toward the people, environments, and dynamics where growth is possible, where the self is not only preserved but invited to expand. When security is present, the unconscious opens. There is less need for defense, less reliance on projection, less fear of vulnerability. What emerges is a more authentic, unguarded version of the self, capable of connection that is not transactional but transformational. The need for emotional safety is not childish or overly sensitive. It is foundational. It is the unseen architecture that holds the emotional structure of love together. To honor the instinct for security is to honor the deep wisdom of the unconscious. It is to recognize that true connection cannot be built on intensity alone, but on the quiet, often invisible foundation of emotional steadiness, reliability, and mutual care. In the end, love may capture our hearts, but it is security that anchors our souls. Without it, even the deepest love struggles to survive. When we understand the quiet power of emotional safety, we no longer chase intensity. We create spaces where connection can truly thrive, because it is not how loudly love begins, but how gently and securely it is held that defines its depth and endurance.